There's a particular kind of pain that has no bruise, no raised voice, no harsh words, no visible evidence of anything wrong. Just silence. A door that closes and doesn't open. A person who was present and then, without warning or explanation, simply isn't. And somehow that silence, that absence, hurts in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Because nothing happened, technically. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody did anything obvious. They just stopped. And you were left in the silence trying to figure out what you did, what you said, how to fix it, whether you're allowed to be hurt by something that isn't really anything at all. You are. And today we're going to talk about why. Let's start with what the silent treatment actually is, because there's an important distinction that most conversations about this topic miss. There is a difference between needing space and giving the silent treatment. Needing space is a legitimate emotional self-regulation strategy. It sounds like, I need some time to process this. I'll come back to this conversation when I'm ready. It has a time frame. It has an intention. It is communicated. The silent treatment is something entirely different. It is the deliberate withdrawal of communication as a response to conflict or perceived transgression, with no explanation, no time frame, and no invitation to resolve anything. It is not about regulating your own emotions. It is about controlling someone else's. And that distinction between self-regulation and control is the line between a healthy coping mechanism and one of the most psychologically damaging forms of relational behavior that exists. Why is it so damaging? Because it targets something fundamental to human psychology. We are social animals. Our nervous systems are wired, literally neurologically wired, for social connection. And the experience of social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The same part of the brain that processes a broken arm processes being shut out by someone you love. This is not metaphor. This is neuroscience. Researchers who study ostracism, the formal term for deliberate social exclusion, have found that even brief experiences of being ignored or excluded produce immediate and measurable psychological distress, drops in self-esteem, increases in anxiety, a disruption in the fundamental sense of belonging that human beings require to function. And the silent treatment, deployed in a close relationship by someone whose connection matters deeply to you, is ostracism at its most intimate and its most potent. Here's what makes it manipulative rather than simply painful. The silent treatment works. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this. It works because the person receiving it, desperate to restore the connection, desperate to end the pain of exclusion, will almost always move toward the person giving it. Will apologize, will accommodate, will change their behavior, will do whatever it takes to make the silence end. And the person giving it learns, consciously or not, that silence is the most effective tool in their relational arsenal. More effective than arguing, more effective than expressing their actual feelings. Because it produces results without requiring them to be vulnerable, to explain themselves, or to engage with the other person as an equal. It is a power move dressed as withdrawal. And over time, in a relationship where it is used regularly, it creates a specific and toxic dynamic. The person on the receiving end becomes hypervigilant, constantly monitoring the other person's mood, constantly managing their own behavior to avoid triggering the silence, constantly operating from a baseline of anxiety about what might cause the next withdrawal. They lose themselves in the management of someone else's silences. Now, let's talk about the people who use it, because this is important. Most people who use the silent treatment are not calculating manipulators who sit down and decide to psychologically damage someone. Most of them learned it. They grew up in environments where silent withdrawal was how conflict was handled, where people went quiet instead of talking, where the withdrawal of warmth was the consequence for perceived wrongdoing, where love was something that could be removed without warning or explanation. And they internalized it as the template for how relationships work during conflict. This doesn't make it acceptable, but it makes it understandable. And understanding the origin matters, both for the person receiving it, who needs to know that the silence is not a verdict on their worth, and for the person giving it, who may genuinely not understand why what they're doing is so damaging. There's another layer to this that is particularly important. The silent treatment is especially destructive because of what it denies the other person. In a normal conflict, even a painful one, both people are present. Both people can express themselves. Both people have access to the relationship and to the possibility of resolution. The conflict has a shape. It has content. It can be engaged with. The silent treatment removes all of that. It doesn't give you something to argue with. It doesn't give you something to apologize for. It doesn't give you a path toward resolution. It just removes the relationship completely without explanation and leaves you in a void of uncertainty about whether it's coming back. So what do you do if you're in a relationship where this is a pattern? The first thing is to name it clearly, to yourself first, and then, if possible, to the other person. Not as an accusation, but as an observation. What happens when you go silent feels like exclusion to me. It produces real psychological distress. I need us to find another way to handle conflict. The second thing is to resist the pull to chase. This is the hardest part, because the instinct, when someone withdraws, is to move toward them, to apologize, to accommodate, to do whatever ends the silence. But chasing reinforces the behavior. It confirms that silence produces the desired result. Not chasing, holding your ground, giving them space without abandoning yourself in the process, is the only response that has any chance of changing the dynamic. The third thing is to be honest with yourself about the pattern. Because in some relationships, the silent treatment is not an occasional lapse. It is the fundamental relational structure. And a relationship built on the repeated withdrawal of connection is not a foundation. It is a cycle. And cycles without intervention continue. You deserve to be in relationships where conflict is handled with words, where your presence is not something that can be revoked without explanation, where disagreement doesn't mean disappearance. That is not too much to ask. It is the minimum. If this describes something you're living inside right now, you already know what it's pointing at.